Years later, I still think about that morning whenever December comes around. It was Christmas Eve, early, the kind of early where the street feels half abandoned and even sound seems tired. I was running on little sleep. I'd stayed up too late wrapping gifts that didn't really need wrapping, drinking coffee that didn't help. I remember stepping outside in a hurry, keys in one hand, phone in the other, already late for work. That's when my neighbor spoke. "Merry Christmas," he said, from the edge of his driveway. I answered automatically, "Merry Christmas." What stands out now is that he never looked at me. His eyes were fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as if he were talking to the space behind me rather than to me. At the time, I chalked it up to shyness, or cold, or the early hour. People act strange before sunrise, especially on holidays. I hesitated just for a second. We'd lived next to each other for years, exchanged nods, signed for packages, complained politely about the weather. I almost added something about the cold, about the day, about how quiet the street was, but I didn't. I smiled, adjusted my coat, and kept walking. As I passed, I noticed he was holding something in his gloved hands. I didn't see what it was. I didn't ask. It felt intrusive, and I was already mentally halfway to my car. Behind me, he said, "Drive safe," still without looking. I lifted a hand in acknowledgement and drove away. It wasn't until much later, weeks, maybe months, that the memory came back with weight. I'd learned in passing that he'd moved out shortly after the holidays, quietly, no goodbye. The house sat empty for a while before someone else bought it. I started replaying that moment, noticing details I'd ignored. The way he stood too close to the street. The way his voice didn't rise or fall, like he was reciting something he'd practiced. The way he waited until I was already walking away before speaking again. Sometimes I wonder if he'd meant to say more, or if he already had, and I'd missed it because I was tired, distracted, focused on my own small urgencies. I don't know what he wanted from me that morning. A conversation, a witness, something simpler. All I know is that he wished me a Merry Christmas without ever meeting my eyes, and I walked away, thinking nothing of it. And every year, when someone says it the same way, too quickly, too carefully, I find myself looking back, half expecting someone to still be standing there, waiting to be noticed. Years later, I still remember that cafe more clearly than places where far more important things happened. It was mid-December, late afternoon, already dark outside. The cafe had gone all in on Christmas, string lights wrapped around the counter, a plastic tree in the corner, red paper snowflakes taped unevenly to the windows. It should have felt warm. Instead, it felt paused, like someone had stepped out and forgotten to turn the sound back on. There were only 3 of us inside, the barista moving slowly, and one man sitting at a table near the window. I chose a table near the heater and set my bag on the chair across from me. I was exhausted. I'd been telling myself all day that I just needed 10 quiet minutes before going home. The man looked up when I sat down. He smiled briefly, then went back to stirring his drink long after the sugar should have dissolved. I didn't think much of it. Empty cafes make strangers feel closer than they are. A few minutes later, he stood and asked if he could sit at my table. I remember hesitating, then nodding. It seemed rude not to. There was plenty of space, and I told myself it was Christmas. People were lonely. People did harmless things for strange reasons. He didn't sit right away. He placed his cup down first, carefully, as if lining it up with something only he could see. Then he sat, keeping his coat on. We made small talk. The decorations, the weather, how quiet it was for this time of year. His eyes kept drifting to the door, not in a nervous way, more like he was checking a schedule. When I asked if he was waiting for someone, he shook his head too quickly and said no.
At one point, he asked what time the cafe closed. I told him. He nodded, satisfied, like that answered something else entirely. The barista turned up the radio, a Christmas song I didn't recognize. The man lowered his voice and asked if I came here often. I said sometimes, which was true enough. He smiled again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. When he stood to leave, he thanked me for keeping him company. That phrasing stuck with me. Not talking to him, not sharing a table, keeping him company like it had been my job. After he left, I noticed his cup was still on the table, untouched since he'd sat down. I almost chased after him to return it, then decided it wasn't worth the effort. The barista would take care of it. I finished my drink and went home, the moment slipping easily into the pile of unimportant days. It wasn't until much later that I realized how carefully he'd chosen that table, that time, that almost empty room, how he'd asked questions that didn't really need answers. I still don't know what he wanted from me that afternoon. I only know that sometimes when I sit alone in a quiet place, I catch myself listening for a chair to scrape softly across the floor, and I wonder if I left too early, or if staying would have been worse.
Years later, I remember that afternoon in pieces, like snapshots out of order. I had been waiting at the bus stop, tired and impatient, my mind elsewhere. The day had stretched thin with errands, a last-minute gift to pick up, a text I couldn't stop rereading. Somehow, the minutes felt heavier than usual, dragging as if the world itself had slowed down to match my fatigue. A man stood a few feet away, leaning on the metal pole with his hands in his pockets. He was humming softly, low enough that I barely noticed at first. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, but quickly looked away, thinking of something else entirely. Minutes passed, or felt like hours, and he shifted closer. Not aggressively, not even purposefully, it seemed, but every time I looked, he was nearer, humming the same note over and over. I told myself it didn't matter. It was an ordinary day, nothing unusual. I fished for my phone, checked the bus schedule again, and let my thoughts wander. Eventually, he spoke. "You're waiting for the next one?" His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, but he didn't make eye contact. I said yes, automatically, thinking it was just polite to respond. We fell into a sort of rhythm after that. Short exchanges, questions that didn't need answers, a nod here, a small smile there. Time dragged on, each moment stretching longer than it should have. I didn't notice at the time how carefully he watched everything I did, how his pauses seemed to align with mine, like he was measuring me against the clock I couldn't keep. When the bus finally came, I was relieved, stepping forward to board. He followed, not onto the bus, but a few steps behind, lingering as if something had been left unsaid. I waved awkwardly and turned, assuming that was the end. It wasn't until weeks later, when I thought back to that day, that I realized how strange it had been, how deliberate his presence had felt, how small gestures I dismissed might have meant something I couldn't understand. I still don't know what he wanted from me in those long, slow minutes. I only know that time itself seemed to bend that day, and I walked away carrying a quiet, lingering question that has never found an answer. Years later, I still notice Christmas music more than I should. That winter, I was working late shifts and sleeping badly. Everything felt slightly out of focus, like I was always a step behind my own thoughts. One evening, on my way home, I stopped at a small convenience store near my apartment. It was the kind of place that stayed open late and never quite felt closed, even when it was nearly empty. As I stood in line, I heard Christmas music playing somewhere nearby. It was faint, tinny, and oddly distant. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the store speakers, a car outside, or a phone left on in someone's pocket. The song was familiar, but I couldn't place which one. That bothered me more than it should have.
The cashier was new. I'd never seen him before. He was polite, quiet, and moved slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. When it was my turn, he smiled without showing his teeth and asked how my night was going. I said, "Fine," the way people do when they don't want to explain anything. As he rang up my items, the music grew a little louder, or maybe I just started paying attention to it. I glanced around, trying to locate the source. The cashier noticed and said, "Funny how it carries, isn't it?" I asked him where it was coming from. He shrugged. "It's always around this time of year." That should have been my cue to stop the conversation, but I was tired and let it pass. I nodded, paid, and reached for my bag. He didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, he asked if I lived nearby. I told him yes, just a few blocks away. It felt harmless. Neighbors talk. People make small connections in quiet places. When he finally slid the bag across the counter, the music stopped. Not faded out, just gone. The silence felt heavier than the sound had. Outside, I paused for a moment, listening. Nothing. No car radio, no distant speaker, no echo of the song I'd been straining to hear. I went home and forgot about it, or thought I did. Weeks later, I returned to the store at the same hour. Different cashier, same shelves, no music. When I asked about the man who'd been working before, the cashier said no one like that was scheduled on nights, and hadn't been for a while. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I left with my receipt and my change and a feeling I couldn't quite explain. I still don't know what he wanted from me, why he asked those small questions, or why the music seemed to exist only while we were talking. Every December, when I hear a Christmas song drifting from somewhere I can't see, I think about that pause at the counter and how easy it was to answer when someone asked me something that didn't really need an answer at all.